Forgotten winter, late spring. Abandoned by his own children, an elderly man lives forgotten, weighed down by memories that never healed. On an ordinary night, a stranger appears at his door, carrying secrets no one had ever dared to reveal. Between silences and revelations, a connection emerges that defies time and blood, and the old man discovers that the past still holds a truth capable of changing everything. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll hear in your life. The bell of the small St. Benedict's Church marked 6 o'clock when Robert Wilson woke up. His tired eyes stared at the peeling ceiling as the first rays of sunlight invaded the simple room through the worn curtain. The 67-year-old man got up with difficulty, feeling the weight of years in each movement. His routine was invariable: wake before the sun, drink a weak coffee, and head to work as a night watchman at a construction site downtown. Robert adjusted the blanket on the single bed and walked to the small kitchen. The one-bedroom apartment in the suburbs of Chicago was too quiet for someone who had once known the noise of 3 children running through the hallways. The dusty photographs on the shelf were silent witnesses to a time that would not return. In them, frozen smiles of a family that no longer existed in the same way. The kettle whistled on the stove as he coughed, a deep, harsh cough that had accompanied him for decades, the result of years working in the coal yard as a child, under the ruthless control of cousins who never considered him family. The doctor had said his lungs were compromised, but Robert didn't have money for proper treatment. The health insurance he had maintained for years for his family had been cancelled when he lost his job at the metal factory. "Good morning, Scruffy," he murmured to the mixed-breed dog stretching in the corner of the kitchen. The animal, with yellowish fur and intelligent eyes, had been his only company for the past 3 years. It had appeared at his door on a rainy night, as thin and helpless as he himself felt. Robert served some dog food for Scruffy and prepared his coffee. He sat at the table watching the neighborhood waking up through the window. In the distance, the Willis Tower embraced the city with its imposing presence, indifferent to the small daily tragedies unfolding beneath its vigilance. The phone rarely rang in that house. His children, Helen, Richard, and Charles, were too busy with their own lives to remember their father. Helen lived in New York with her executive husband. Richard had moved to Portugal in search of better opportunities, and Charles, the youngest, lived just a few miles away, but the emotional distance seemed insurmountable. On Charles's last visit, more than 2 months ago, his son had suggested that his father sell the apartment and go to a nursing home. "It's for your own good, Dad. There you'll have medical assistance company, here you're alone." Robert didn't respond. He knew that behind his son's concern was interest in the money from selling the property. The apartment was the only thing of value he owned, bought with the severance money from the metal factory. It was small, but it was his, the last refuge of his dignity. As he drank his coffee, he thought about how his life had taken that path. Born in rural Kentucky, he had lost his mother very early when she gave birth to his younger brother. His father, destroyed by the loss, drowned in alcohol and disappeared after a fight in a local tavern. The 3 brothers were separated. Robert, only 9 years old, was sent to live with an aunt in a small town in the countryside. He never saw his brothers again. The aunt, a woman of few words and even less affection, put him to work in the family coal yard. The older cousin, a man with a permanently red face and heavy hands, turned his childhood into a nightmare of soot and humiliation. It was in that coal yard that he met Michael, a dreamy young man who talked about books and a world beyond those. Mountains of coal. Michael taught him to read properly and awakened in him the desire for change. At 18, Robert gathered courage and some loose change and ran away. The wall clock showed 7 o'clock. Robert sighed, rising with difficulty. It was time to lie down to rest before the night shift. His life now worked in reverse. He slept during the day, kept watch at night. Like a nocturnal animal, he avoided the light, hid in the shadows, existed on the margins. Scruffy followed him to the bedroom, settling at the foot of the bed. Robert lay down, but sleep didn't come easily. Memories danced in his mind like restless ghosts. He remembered the first time he arrived in Chicago, young and scared but determined. He got a job as a construction helper and enrolled in a night school. It was at that construction site that he met Ernest, an engineer who saw in him something more than a simple laborer. Ernest became his friend, his mentor. It was at his house that Robert met Sarah, Ernest's younger sister. Sarah, with her green eyes and her discreet smile, transformed his world. The love between them was born silently, grew in the shadows, fed by furtive glances and whispered conversations in the garden of the house. They feared Ernest's reaction, the only true friend Robert had ever had. When they finally gathered the courage to reveal their relationship, Ernest surprised them with his understanding. But Sarah's father, an influential and authoritarian businessman, did not share the same openness. A laborer, Sarah, a nobody, from the countryside with no family, no name. Is that what you choose? Augustus Matthews used all his power and influence to separate them. He sent Sarah to a boarding school in Europe, threatened Robert with false accusations, and even pressured Ernest to break the friendship. Robert closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those old memories. Sarah had disappeared from his life like a dream at dawn. For years he tried to find her, without success. Eventually the pain diminished enough for him to move on. He met Mary on a crowded bus. She was a nurse, practical and kind. It wasn't an overwhelming love like what he had felt for Sarah, but it was a solid love, built day by day on the foundations of companionship and mutual respect. They married, had 3 children, built a life together. Robert always worked hard to give his children what he never had: education, opportunities, security. Even when his health began to fail, he didn't slow down. The metal factory where he had worked for decades ended up dismissing him when his respiratory problems became too evident. Without adequate compensation, with 3 children to support, he accepted the first job that appeared: night watchman. Mary never complained when they had to take the kids out of private school, when they had to move to a smaller apartment, when medical bills began to accumulate. She simply rolled up her sleeves and started working as a house cleaner to supplement the income. Until that Sunday, when she served breakfast as she always did, smiled at him, and fell to the kitchen floor. Robert opened his eyes, interrupting the painful memory. Mary's permanent absence was a wound that refused to heal completely. It had been 7 years, but the pain was as fresh as if it were yesterday. Scruffy raised his head, looking at his owner with understanding eyes. Robert extended his hand to pet the dog. "It's just the 2 of us now, buddy," he murmured. Sleep finally enveloped him, but it wasn't a peaceful rest. He dreamed of Sarah, of Mary, of his children. He dreamed of the coal yard and the smell of soot that had never left his lungs. And strangely, he dreamed of a young man with familiar eyes who extended his hand to him. He woke up startled at 4 in the afternoon, with Scruffy's barking announcing someone at the door. Robert got up, confused. He wasn't expecting visitors. When he opened the door, he encountered a tall man, approximately 30 years old, wearing a well-cut suit and carrying a leather briefcase. "Mr. Robert Wilson?" asked the stranger with an educated voice. "Yes, that's me," replied Robert, suspicious. "My name is Luke Matthews. I'm an engineer from the construction company that has taken over the site where you work as a watchman. We need to talk about some changes to the project." Robert frowned. Why would an engineer come to his house to talk about the construction site? Normally, such matters were dealt with at the workplace, with the supervisor as an intermediary. "Come in," he finally said, making way. What Robert didn't know was that that visit would completely change the course of his lonely existence. Robert observed the young engineer settle into his worn sofa. There was something familiar about that face, in the defined features, in the way the eyes scanned the environment, not with contempt, but with genuine curiosity. Scruffy, normally wary of strangers, approached the visitor, sniffing his hands, with unusual interest. "Would you like some coffee?" offered Robert, more out of habit than hospitality. "Yes, thank you," replied Luke with a discreet smile. In the small kitchen, as the water boiled, Robert tried to understand the purpose of that visit. Why would an engineer in an expensive suit come personally to the house of a simple watchman? The construction company he worked for was known for its rigid hierarchy, where laborers rarely had direct contact with upper management. When he returned with 2 cups of coffee, he found Luke examining one of the photographs on the shelf. It was an old image yellowed by time. Robert, still young, beside Mary and their 3 small children on a Sunday at the beach. "Your family?" asked Luke, returning the frame to its place. "Yes," replied Robert dryly, handing him the coffee. "You said you wanted to talk about changes at the site." Luke nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. He didn't make any grimace at the strong, bitter taste, something that surprised Robert. "Actually, Mr. Wilson, the construction site is only part of the reason for my visit," began Luke, placing the cup on the coffee table. "We're planning a significant expansion, and we need reinforced security. I came to offer you a position as security supervisor with a better salary and benefits, including health insurance." Robert frowned, suspicious. Offers like this didn't fall from the sky, especially for a man of his age, with evident health problems. "Why me? There are dozens of younger, stronger watchmen." Luke smiled, a smile that seemed to hide something. "I value experience, Mr. Wilson, and you have a reputation for reliability. You've never missed a day, never left your post." There was more to that story. Robert could feel it, but the offer was too tempting to refuse. Health insurance would mean access to treatment for his lungs. A better salary would allow for a slightly less tight life. "When would I start?" he finally asked. "Next week. But first, I'd like to get to know you better. Actually, I have some questions about your past." Robert's discomfort was visible. "My past? What does that have to do with the job?" Luke hesitated, as if carefully choosing his words. "You worked in construction before becoming a watchman, correct? You were a construction helper when you arrived in Chicago." Robert nodded slowly, his suspicion growing. "How do you know that?" "I researched your work history," Luke replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. "And you knew an engineer named Ernest Matthews at that time." The name fell like a stone in the tranquil lake of Robert's memories. Ernest, his only true friend, the man who had opened doors for him, who had believed in him when no one else did. Ernest, Sarah's brother, the love he had never completely forgotten. "I did," admitted Robert, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Many years ago." Luke's eyes shone in a strange way. "He was my uncle," he revealed. Robert's heart accelerated. If Luke was Ernest's nephew, then... "You also knew Sarah, his sister." "Didn't you?" continued Luke, closely observing the old man's reaction. Robert felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Sarah, the name he rarely allowed himself to pronounce, even in thought. Images of her flooded his mind, the shy smile, the brown hair, tied in a loose bun, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about literature. "Yes," he finally answered, his voice almost a whisper. "I knew Sarah." Luke took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "Mr. Wilson, I'm not here just to offer you a job. I'm here because I've spent the last 2 years looking for you." The silence that followed was dense, loaded with unformulated questions. "Sarah Matthews was my mother," Luke finally said. Robert's world stopped. The words hung in the air like impossible birds. Sarah, Luke's mother. Sarah, who had disappeared from his life more than 40 years ago. Sarah, whom his heart had never completely forgotten. "Your mother," repeated Robert, as if trying to understand the meaning of those words. How is she?" Luke's expression darkened slightly. "My mother left us 3 years ago, a heart problem that suddenly worsened." Robert closed his eyes, feeling a deep pain in his chest. Sarah had departed from this world without him knowing, without him being able to say goodbye. One more loss to add to the long list he carried. "I'm sorry," he murmured, realizing the inadequacy of the words. "Before departing," continued Luke, "she gave me a box. Inside were letters, photographs, newspaper clippings, a lifetime of memories kept. And she told me a story, Mr. Wilson, the story of a love interrupted by the ambition and pride of my grandfather." Robert raised his eyes, finding in Luke's face features that he now recognized as familiar. They weren't just Sarah's features, but something more, something disturbingly close. "My mother was sent to France when my grandfather discovered about you two," explained Luke. "She was pregnant, Mr. Wilson, 2 months along." The words hit Robert like a physical blow. Pregnant. Sarah was pregnant when she disappeared from his life. He began, but the words failed him. "My grandfather kept her there until I was born. Afterward, they returned to the United States, but to New York, not Chicago. He threatened her, saying he would disinherit her if she tried to find you. He threatened to use his influence to harm you in every possible way." Robert stood, up with difficulty, walking to the window. The revelation was too much to process all at once. All this time, while he was building a life with Mary, while he was raising his 3 children, there was another child. A child he didn't even know existed. "She never married," continued Luke, his voice softer now. "She raised me alone, with help from Uncle Ernest, who defied my grandfather to support her. She told stories about you, about how you met, about the dreams you shared. She kept every newspaper clipping that mentioned the construction company where you worked. She followed your life from a distance, without ever interfering." Why? The question escaped Robert's lips before he could contain it. "Why did she never look for me after your grandfather passed away?" "Fear," replied Luke simply. "Fear that you would reject her, that you had already moved on and wouldn't want to resurrect the past. And then when she learned that you had married, had children, she didn't want to interfere with your happiness." Robert shook his head, a mixture of sadness and disbelief taking hold of him. So many years lost, so many possibilities interrupted. "And you?" he finally asked, turning to face Luke. "Why did you look for me now?" Luke stood up, approaching with slow steps. He took a yellowed envelope from the briefcase he had brought. "Because she asked me to," he answered, extending the envelope to Robert. "On her deathbed, she asked me to find you, to deliver this to you, and to tell you that despite everything, she never regretted the love you lived." With trembling hands, Robert took the envelope. Inside, there was a handwritten letter and an old photograph. In the image, Sarah smiled, radiant, holding a baby in her arms. Upon turning the photo over, he read the inscription, "Luke, 3 months. Our son, Robert." The tears that Robert had tried so hard to contain over the years now flowed freely down his wrinkled face. It was as if a dam had broken inside him, releasing decades of repressed emotions. "I didn't just come to bring news from the past," said Luke, gently placing his hand on the old man's shoulder. "I came to offer you a future, Mr. Wilson. A place in my life, in the life of the family you didn't even know you had." Robert raised his eyes, confused. "Family?" "Uncle Ernest never forgot you. He talks about the friend he lost, about how determined you were, about how he believed in your potential. He wants to see you again." The mention of Ernest brought a new whirlwind of emotions. His friend, his only true friend, still remembered him after so many years. "And there's more," continued Luke. "I have a wife, Beatrice, and 2 little daughters. Your granddaughters. We live in a spacious house in Lincoln Park with a large garden where Scruffy would love to run." Robert could hardly believe what he was hearing. Granddaughters. The word had a strange but sweet taste. His other granddaughters, daughters of Helen, Richard, and Charles, barely knew him. Quick visits on birthdays, an occasional phone call, at Christmas. And now suddenly there was this new family opening up to him. "Why would you do this?" he asked, still suspicious. "Why would you welcome me now?" Luke's smile was genuine, warm. "Because I grew up hearing stories about you. Because my mother loved you until her last day. Because blood is stronger than time or distance, and because I believe it's never too late to start over." Scruffy approached, pressing his nose against Robert's leg, as if encouraging him. "I need to think," Robert finally said. "It's a lot to absorb at once." Luke nodded, understanding. "Of course, take all the time you need. I'll be at the site tomorrow night. We can talk more there if you prefer." As they said goodbye at the door, Luke hesitated, then briefly hugged Robert. It was the first genuinely affectionate physical contact the old man had received in years. "See you tomorrow, Dad," whispered Luke, before walking away down the hallway. When the door closed, Robert remained motionless, Sarah's letter in one hand, the photograph in the other. Luke's words echoed in his mind. Dad. No one had called him that in a long time. His own children referred to him by name when they spoke of him to others, as if the word Dad was inadequate, uncomfortable. Slowly, Robert walked to his worn armchair and sat down. Scruffy settled at his feet, looking at him expectantly. "What do you think of this, buddy?" he asked the dog. "A new family after all this time?" With careful fingers, he opened Sarah's letter. Her handwriting was exactly as he remembered, delicate but firm, like she herself had always been. "My dear Robert," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means I am no longer in this world, and that our son has found you, as I asked him to." Sarah's words, written shortly before her departure, spoke of love, of regrets, of hopes never abandoned. They spoke of a son raised with stories about a heroic father who had faced poverty and prejudice, to study, to grow, to be someone. They spoke of a love that, although interrupted by the cruelty of fate, had never truly ended. On the last page, a phrase made Robert's heart tighten. "Forgive me for not being braver, for not fighting more. And know that in every important moment of our son's life, I saw you in his eyes, in his smile, in his determination. You were never really absent." Robert carefully folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. The clock on the wall showed 6 o'clock. Soon he would have to prepare for his shift at the site. But for the first time in many years, the future didn't seem just an empty repetition of the past. There was a possibility pulsing on the horizon, a late chance to know a part of himself that he never knew existed. "Our son, Sarah," he murmured, to the yellowed portrait. "Our son has found us." The night at the construction site passed more slowly than usual for Robert. Each minute seemed to stretch infinitely as he walked through the empty floors of the building under construction, the flashlight illuminating the path between exposed beams and unfinished walls. His mind, however, was far from there. He constantly revisited the conversation with Luke, Sarah's letter, the yellowed photo he now carried in the inside pocket of his coat, next to his heart. At 5 in the morning, when the first workers began to arrive, Robert had already made his decision. He would wait for Luke as agreed and accept his invitation, not out of charity or convenience, but because at 67 he deserved a chance to know the son he never knew existed. He deserved to meet his granddaughters, to reunite with his old friend Ernest. He deserved a different ending to his story. Sitting on a pile of cement bags, he watched the sky gradually lighten over Chicago. The city awoke in a spectacle of lights and sounds that he rarely appreciated, accustomed to sleeping during the day. He wondered what his life would be like from now on. Would he be able to adapt to a new routine? Would he be able to open space in his hardened heart for new affections? "Thinking about life, Mr. Wilson," Luke's voice interrupted his musings. "These?" Engineer approached, this time wearing more casual clothes, jeans and a button-up shirt. He looked younger like this, more accessible, more like the young man Robert had once been. "Thinking about the future," replied Robert, standing up with difficulty. The cold night had stiffened his joints. Luke smiled, that smile that reminded him so much of Sarah. "And what conclusions did you reach?" "I accept your invitation," said Robert simply, "if the offer is still open." Luke's face lit up. "Of course. It is. Actually, I came earlier precisely to pick you up. Your shift is already over, right? We can stop by your apartment to get Scruffy and some clothes. The rest can be fetched later." The speed of events surprised Robert. He had expected some time to organize, to prepare mentally. But perhaps it was better this way, less time for doubts, for fears. "And my replacement here?" he asked, practical as always. "I've already arranged it," replied Luke. "The new watchman starts tonight. You are officially on vacation until you assume your new position as security supervisor in 2 weeks." On the way to the apartment, Robert observed the city through the window of Luke's luxury car. Chicago was different seen like this, comfortably installed in the passenger seat of a vehicle with air conditioning, far from the crowded buses he used to take. "I haven't told my wife and daughters about you yet," commented Luke as he drove. "I wanted to be sure you would accept before creating expectations." Robert nodded, grateful for the consideration. "What are they like? Your wife, your daughters?" Luke's smile widened. "Beatrice is an architect. We met in college. She's practical, determined, with a huge heart beneath a tough exterior. The girls are amazing. Laura is 6, a little scientist, always wanting to take things apart to see how they work. Julia is 4, more artistic, always drawing and inventing stories." The description made Robert smile slightly. He remembered his own children at those ages. Helen always with a book, Richard building cities with blocks, Charles running through the house, tireless. "And they know about me? About the story of your mother with me?" Luke hesitated briefly. "Beatrice knows. She was by my side during the entire search for you. The girls know they have another grandfather, but they don't understand the complexity of the situation, of course." When they arrived at the apartment, Scruffy greeted them with excited barks. The dog seemed to sense that something important was happening. While Robert separated some clothes and essential items, Luke walked around the small space, observing the photographs, the few books on the shelf, the simple objects that made up his biological father's life. "We need to notify your other children," Luke suddenly said. "I don't want to create problems in your family." Robert stopped what he was doing, reflecting. His children with Mary. How would they react to knowing they had a half-brother, that their father was going to live with this newly discovered son? "I can call them later," he finally replied. "But don't worry. They have their own lives. They rarely visit me." There was a note of bitterness in his voice that didn't go unnoticed by Luke. "I'm sure they care about you in their own way," said the engineer gently. Robert didn't respond. He closed the small suitcase, took the medicine box from the bathroom, cabinet and Scruffy's leash hanging behind the door. "I'm ready," he announced. As he left, he cast a last glance at the apartment that had been his home in recent years. He didn't feel sadness at leaving it, just a strange sensation of turning a page that had been worn out for a long time. The journey to Lincoln Park was silent. Luke respected Robert's need to process everything that was happening. Scruffy, in the back seat, seemed enthusiastic about the adventure, his nose pressed against the window, watching the city pass by. Luke's house surprised Robert. It wasn't the ostentatious mansion he had imagined, but an elegant and welcoming construction, with a well-maintained front garden and a spacious porch. There was something familiar in the architecture, a style that reminded him of the houses Sarah had admired in the magazines they leafed through together so many years ago. "We're here," announced Luke, parking the car in the garage. "Beatrice must be preparing breakfast. The girls are probably still sleeping." Robert felt his heart accelerate. It was real now. He was about to enter the lives of people who didn't know him, who had their own routines, their own habits. People who, despite the blood tie, were strangers to him. "Is everything okay?" asked Luke, noticing his hesitation. "Yes," replied Robert, taking a deep breath. "Just nervous." Luke smiled, understanding. "It's natural, but trust me, you will be welcome." As they entered, the aroma of fresh coffee and freshly baked bread invaded Robert's nostrils. The house was bright, with large windows that let the morning sun enter freely. The decoration was simple but elegant, with dark wooden furniture and details in earthy tones that reminded him of rural Kentucky. "Luke, is that you?" A female voice came from the kitchen. "Yes, honey, and I brought a visitor." Beatrice appeared in the hallway, drying her hands on a floral apron. She was a beautiful woman of medium height, short brown hair, and intelligent eyes. Her smile upon seeing Robert was genuinely warm. "Mr. Wilson, welcome," she said, approaching to greet him. "Luke has told me so much about you." "Please call me Robert," he replied awkwardly. He wasn't used to so much kindness. "And who is this furry friend?" asked Beatrice, bending down to pet Scruffy, who immediately wagged his tail. "One over." "This is Scruffy," introduced Robert. My companion for some years. Well, Scruffy, you are very welcome too. We have a backyard where you'll love to run. The naturalness with which Beatrice received him, as if his arrival was expected and desired, disconcerted Robert. Where was the distrust, the estrangement he expected? Why did this woman, who had never seen him before, treat him with such consideration? Let's have breakfast, invited Beatrice. Afterward, Luke will show you your room. You must be tired after the night shift. In the spacious kitchen, the table was set for 4 people. Beatrice quickly added one more place. Are the girls still sleeping? Asked Luke, serving himself coffee. Yes, but not for much longer, especially when they discover we have a visiting dog. As they ate, Robert observed the interaction between Luke and Beatrice. The complicity between them was evident, in the exchanged glances, in the small gestures, in the way they seemed to communicate without words. It reminded him of how it had been with Mary in the good times before financial difficulties and her illness wore down their relationship. Ernest will come for lunch, commented Beatrice casually. He's very anxious to see you, Robert. Ernest. His old friend, the man who had opened doors for him, who had believed in him when no one else did. The thought of seeing him again after so many years made a knot form in Robert's throat. I'm anxious too, he managed to say. The sound of hurried footsteps interrupted the conversation. A girl with curly brown hair burst into the kitchen, still. In pajamas, her wide eyes fixed on Scruffy. A dog, she exclaimed, ecstatic. Daddy, you brought a dog. Laura, said Luke, smiling. This is Scruffy, and this is Mr. Wilson, the grandfather I told you about. The word grandfather hung in the air for a moment. Robert felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. He was a grandfather to Helen's children and the twins, Charles's children, but they saw him rarely. Being introduced like this, as an important family figure, was a new experience. Laura looked at him with childish curiosity, without shyness or fear. Are you Grandma Sarah's dad, the one in the photograph? No, dear, Luke gently corrected. He's my father, which makes him your grandfather too. The girl frowned, processing the information. Then, with the simple logic of children, she shrugged and accepted it. Can I play with Scruffy? Of course, replied Robert, surprising himself with the readiness. He loves children. While Laura took Scruffy to the backyard, under Beatrice's watchful eye, Luke led Robert to the room that would be his. It was a spacious room with a double bed, a desk, a spacious wardrobe, and a window that overlooked the backyard. I hope it's comfortable, said Luke. Feel free to make any changes you want. Robert looked around, impressed. The room was bigger than his entire apartment. The bed seemed more comfortable than any he had ever slept in. There were fresh flowers in a vase on the dresser, a touch that could only be from Beatrice. It's perfect, he murmured. But I don't want to be a burden. I can help with expenses. I have some savings. Luke shook his head firmly. Don't worry about that now. The important thing is that you rest. We'll have time to discuss practical arrangements later. Left alone, Robert sat on the edge of the bed, trying to assimilate everything. In less than 24 hours, his life had completely turned around. He had left a lonely apartment for a house full of life, from being an abandoned old man to being an expected grandfather, from having no one to having a family. He lay down, feeling the soft mattress accommodate his tired body. Through the door, he could hear laughter coming from the backyard. Laura playing with Scruffy, sounds of life, of joy, sounds his apartment hadn't known in years. Before falling asleep, Robert took the photograph of Sarah with baby Luke. He looked long at the face of the woman he had loved, at the son he hadn't known. Thank you, Sarah, he whispered, for not forgetting me, for giving Luke the chance to find me. Sleep came quickly, and for the first time in many years, without nightmares, without the feeling of emptiness that accompanied him upon waking. In his dream, Sarah smiled at him, young and radiant as the last time he had seen her. At her side, Mary also smiled without resentment, as if she approved of the course his life was taking. He was awakened hours later by soft knocks on the door. Confused for a moment, he didn't recognize where he was. Then reality returned. He was in Luke's house, his son's house. Robert, Beatrice's voice came from the other side of the door. Sorry to wake you, but Ernest has arrived. He's anxious to see you. Robert's heart accelerated. Ernest, after almost 4 decades. I'm coming, he replied, getting up quickly. He took the clean clothes he had separated, fixed himself up as best he could, and taking a deep breath, opened the door. In the hallway, Beatrice waited for him with a gentle smile. He's in the living room, she said, indicating the way. With hesitant steps, Robert followed her. As he entered the spacious living room, he saw a grey-haired man sitting in an armchair, chatting animatedly with Luke. Upon seeing him, the man stood up, his eyes fixed on him. Ernest Matthews had aged, of course. The once black hair was now almost completely white, the face marked by deep wrinkles. But the eyes were the same, lively, intelligent, kind. "Robert," said Ernest, his voice choked. "My old friend." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, as if responding to an invisible signal, they advanced simultaneously, meeting in the middle of the room in a tight embrace. Tears that Robert didn't know he could still shed flowed freely down his face. "Ernest," he finally managed to say. "How long it's been?" When they separated, both were laughing and crying at the same time, like boys. Luke observed the scene with misty eyes. Beatrice discreetly wiped away a tear. "I have so much to tell you," said Ernest, not letting go of his friend's shoulders. "So many years to recover." Robert nodded, unable to speak. The emotion of the reunion was almost physical, a warmth that spread through his chest, melting layers of ice that had protected him for decades. "But first," continued Ernest, "I want you to meet my wife." An elegant woman, whom Robert hadn't noticed before, rose from a sofa in the corner of the room. She approached with a gentle smile. "Robert, this is Marianne, my wife of 30 years. Marianne extended her hand, which Robert awkwardly shook. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you," she said. "Ernest has been talking about you for so long that I feel like we already know each other." The lunch that followed was a celebration. The dining room table, extended to accommodate everyone, was replete with dishes prepared by Beatrice and Marianne. Little Julia, whom Robert had met shortly before the meal, sat beside him, fascinated by the new grandfather. Scruffy lazily rested under the table, occasionally receiving secret treats from the girls. As they ate, they talked. Ernest told about his career as an engineer, about how he had founded his own construction company, now managed by Luke. He talked about Sarah, about how he had fought to maintain contact with his sister against their father's will, about how he had helped raise Luke, being for him the father he couldn't have. "I never stopped looking for you," confessed Ernest. "For years I tried to track your whereabouts, but you moved addresses frequently, and my father, he had ways of making the searches difficult." Robert nodded, understanding. Augustus Matthews had been a powerful man, with connections everywhere. It wouldn't be difficult for him to erase the traces of a simple laborer. "The important thing is that we're here now," he said, surprising himself with the serenity in his voice. "The past cannot be changed, but the future is still ours." The words seemed to touch everyone at the table deeply. Luke raised his glass in a silent toast. Beatrice smiled, approving. The girls, although not completely understanding the meaning of the moment, felt its importance and remained quiet for an instant. In that moment, sitting at the table surrounded by people who welcomed him with open arms, Robert understood that life had granted him a second chance, a late opportunity, it's true, but still precious. The chance to know his son, to see his granddaughters grow, to recover the friendship that time and circumstances had stolen. For the first time in many years, Robert Wilson felt complete. He felt at home. The weeks that followed brought Robert a gradual adaptation to his new life. The routine in Luke's house was completely different from what he was used to. Instead of the oppressive silence of his apartment, there was the constant buzz of a family, the girls' laughter, the conversations at the table during meals, the sound of the piano that Beatrice occasionally played on Friday nights. At first, he felt like an intruder, a silent observer of a happiness that didn't belong to him. He spent hours in his room, coming out only for meals, afraid of imposing his presence. But, as the days passed, The barriers began to fall. Laura and Julia were the first to completely win him over, dragging him to drawing sessions, asking him to tell them stories of his childhood, the good parts, which he had to make an effort to remember. "Grandpa Robert, is it true that you built buildings?" asked Laura one afternoon as they played in the backyard. "Not exactly, little one," he replied, smiling at his granddaughter's innocence. "I helped build them. I carried bricks, mixed cement." "Like Daddy?" "No, your father is an engineer. He designs the buildings, says how they should be made. I just followed orders." Laura frowned, processing the information. "But that's important too, isn't it? Without people to carry the bricks, the buildings wouldn't stand." The simplicity of the observation touched Robert deeply. Throughout his life he had felt insignificant, just an easily replaceable cog in the great machine of the world. But in his granddaughter's eyes, his work had value, had dignity. "Yes, Laura," he replied, his voice choked. "That's important too." The new position as security supervisor at the construction company proved to be less physically demanding than his old job as a watchman, but more mentally challenging. Luke had created the position especially for him, adapting the responsibilities to his capabilities. Robert coordinated a team of watchmen, prepared schedules, verified incident reports. His practical knowledge, acquired in decades in construction, was valued and respected by younger colleagues. The health insurance that came with the job allowed him to finally receive proper treatment for his lungs. There was no cure for the damage caused by the years in the coal yard, but modern medications significantly alleviated the symptoms. The cough that had accompanied him for decades became less frequent, less painful. Every Sunday, Ernest and Marianne visited for lunch, a family tradition that quickly included Robert. On these occasions, the old friends caught up, shared memories, built new ones. It was as if the 40 years of separation slowly dissolved, filled by stories, laughter, and sometimes tears. "Remember that foreman at the downtown site?" asked Ernest at one of these lunches. "The one who tried to frame you for stealing material?" Robert nodded, his face suddenly serious. "How could I forget? I was almost arrested because of him. I never told you, but I discovered years later that he was involved with a gang that diverted construction materials. He was eventually arrested, served 5 years in prison." The news, even after so much time, brought Robert a strange feeling of late justice. So many times in life he had felt powerless in the face of others' malice, unable to adequately defend himself. Knowing that, at least in that case, the truth had prevailed, was an unexpected balm. But not everything was moments of harmony and happy discoveries. There still remained the question of his other children, Helen, Richard, and Charles. The cow. News that their father had moved to the house of a previously unknown son fell like a bomb on the family. It was Charles who called first. A few days after the move, his voice tense with indignation. "What do you mean you went to live with a stranger, Dad? Who is this Luke? Why did you never talk about him before?" Robert patiently explained the situation. He talked about Sarah, the interrupted love, how Luke had found him. He talked about Ernest, about Beatrice, about the granddaughters. He tried to convey how that new family had welcomed him without reservations, without judgments. "So you're saying you traded us for them?" The hurt in Charles's voice was palpable. "That you prefer to live with people you barely know than with your own children?" "That's not it, Charles," replied Robert, keeping calm. "Luke is also my son, and there was never an invitation from any of you for me to live with you." The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with untold truths. Charles knew his father was right. On the rare occasions when he visited his father in the small apartment, he always showed discomfort, hurry to leave. The suggestion that Robert move to a nursing home had been the last concrete proposal he had made. "This doesn't seem right," Charles finally said. "This man appears out of nowhere, says he's your son, and you simply believe it?" "I believe it because it's true," replied Robert firmly. "Luke has his mother's eyes. He has the same way of speaking as Ernest. And he has my smile, Charles. The same smile you have." The conversation ended without a clear resolution. In the days that followed, Helen and Richard also called, expressing similar concerns, although in less confrontational ways. Robert listened to them all patiently. understanding that the situation was confusing and potentially threatening for children who, despite the distance, still considered themselves his only family. It was Luke who suggested a solution. "Why? Don't we invite them for lunch here at home? That way they can meet me, meet Beatrice and the girls, see that there's nothing suspicious happening." The idea was good, but Robert hesitated. He knew his children well enough to know that the meeting could be tense, uncomfortable. What would happen if they rejected Luke, if they didn't accept that new family configuration? "They are your children as much as I am," insisted Luke. "They are part of you, part of your history. And like it or not, we are all a family now." The lunch was set for a Sunday 2 weeks later. Ernest and Marianne were also invited, for moral support and also because Ernest was a fundamental part of the story that united Robert and Luke. The morning of the meeting dawned sunny, as if the very sky conspired for a happy ending. Beatrice and Marianne had been moving about the kitchen since early, preparing a special meal. Laura and Julia, excited about the idea of meeting more relatives, helped set the table, placing name cards at each place. Robert, however, felt a knot in his stomach. He feared his children would arrive with hostility, that they would accuse him of abandonment, that they would reject Luke and his family. He feared most of all that they would force him to choose. "Everything will be fine," assured Luke, perceiving his anxiety. "They are adults. They will understand." The first to arrive was Richard, directly from the airport. He had come from Portugal especially for the occasion, something that deeply surprised Robert. Richard, always the most distant of the three, rarely returned to the United States, even on commemorative dates. The embrace between father and son was brief, almost formal. Richard seemed nervous, displaced, his eyes critically examining the elegant house. When Luke approached to introduce himself, the resemblance between the half-brothers, both tall, athletic build with the same face shape, was undeniable. "So you're the secret son," said Richard, cautiously extending his hand. "And you must." "Be Richard, the computer engineer," replied Luke, shaking the extended hand. "Your father talks a lot about you, about your talent with computers since childhood." The surprise on Richard's face was evident. He clearly didn't expect Robert to talk about him to his new family, much less highlight his qualities. Helen arrived next, accompanied by her husband, Paul. Always the most diplomatic of the three, she greeted everyone politely, although her tension was perceptible in the key way her hands didn't stay still, constantly adjusting her pearl necklace. "Your house is beautiful," she commented to Beatrice, while observing the decoration details. "Very welcoming." "Thank you," replied Beatrice with a genuine smile. "Your father helped us with some details. He has a great eye for colors." The information seemed to surprise Helen. The father she knew had always been practical, disinterested in aesthetic matters. Seeing him in this new light as someone with opinions about decoration was disconcerting. Charles was the last to arrive, alone. Since his divorce 2 years before, he had been living in a small apartment not far from there. Of all, he seemed the most uncomfortable, the most defensive. He briefly hugged his father, greeted Luke with a nod of his head, and completely ignored Ernest. The lunch began in a climate of tense formality, polite conversations about the weather, about Richard's trip, about Helen's work. The children, oblivious to the adults' tension, chattered animatedly, asking innocent questions that occasionally broke the ice. "Are you my uncles too?" asked Julia, to Helen, Richard, and Charles. "Like Uncle Ernest?" The question, in its childish simplicity, captured the essence of the situation. They were all in some way family now, connected by Robert, united by blood ties, even if separated by decades of mutual ignorance. It was during dessert that Charles finally expressed what seemed to have been bothering him from the beginning. "So, Luke," he began, in a falsely casual tone, "it must have been quite a surprise to discover a father you never knew existed, especially a father without many financial resources." The silence that followed was heavy. The insinuation was clear. Charles suspected material interests behind Luke's approach. Robert opened his mouth to defend his son, but Luke was quicker. "Yes, it was a surprise," he replied calmly. "But not for the reasons you imagine. It was surprising to discover that the man my mother described as upright, hard-working and dignified was exactly that. It was surprising to find in Robert not just my biological father, but a person who, despite all the difficulties he faced, kept his humanity intact." The sincerity in Luke's words was undeniable. Even Charles, with all his suspicions, seemed touched. "As for financial resources," continued Luke, "my father built something much more valuable than money. He built character. He raised us, you three and me, even at a distance, with solid values. That is priceless." Robert felt his eyes water. He had never thought of himself as someone who had built something of value. He had always seen himself as a failure, someone who had fought his whole life just to survive, without ever really winning. "I know this situation is strange for all of us," said Luke, looking at each of the half-siblings. "We didn't grow up together. We don't share childhood memories. But we share something fundamental. The blood of Robert Wilson runs in our veins. And, if you give it a chance, we can build new bonds, new memories." Luke's speech seemed to dissipate, part of the tension in the air. Helen was the first to smile, nodding slightly. Richard, always more reserved, remained neutral, but the initial hostility had considerably diminished. Charles, however, still struggled with his feelings. So of all the children, he was the one who most resented what he saw as abandonment by his father. Not physical abandonment, but emotional. The feeling that Robert, even when present, had always been distant, always working, always too tired to really participate in their lives. "Why did you never tell us about her?" he finally asked, looking directly at his father. "About Sarah, about this relationship from the past." The question caught Robert by surprise. Of all the questions he expected, this wasn't among them. "Because it hurt too much," he answered honestly, "and because I loved your mother. I didn't want her to think she had been a second choice." "And was she?" Charles's voice trembled slightly. "No," replied Robert firmly. "I loved Sarah, yes, she was my first love, intense and youthful. But I loved your mother deeply, in a different, more mature way. She was my companion, my support, my strength for 30 years. It was never a matter of comparison." The response seemed to satisfy Charles, at least partially. Robert saw something relax in his son's tense shoulders. It was Ernest who changed the course of the conversation, starting to tell stories of when he and Robert were young, stories that the children had never heard, that showed a side of their father they didn't. "I noticed the determined young man who studied at night after a full day of heavy work, the loyal friend who once faced an abusive foreman to defend a weaker colleague." The stories flowed, and with them the laughter. Laura and Julia listened, fascinated, proud, that their grandfather turned out to be a person with a life full of adventures and challenges. Helen, Richard, and Charles also listened with renewed interest, seeing their father in a different light. When the afternoon began to fall, the atmosphere had completely changed. There was no longer the initial tension, just the warmth of an expanded family discovering each other. Before leaving, Helen hugged Luke for a long time. "Thank you for finding him," she whispered, "for bringing him back to us." Richard exchanged contacts with Luke, promising to send photos of Portugal, where his half-brother had mentioned wanting to visit someday. Even Charles, the most resistant, invited Robert and Luke to watch a football game at his apartment the following week. When everyone had left, Robert sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the quiet neighborhood. Scruffy lay at his feet, his head resting on his legs. The old dog seemed as content as he was with the unfolding of events. "It went better than expected, didn't it?" Luke sat beside him, extending a cup of tea. Robert nodded, without words to express the gratitude he felt. For decades, he had lived with the sensation of being a stranger in his own life, a passive spectator of his story. Now, for the first time, he felt truly a protagonist. "You know what impresses me most about you, Dad?" continued Luke. "Your ability to move forward. After everything you've been through, the difficult childhood, the separation from Sarah, the health problems, the loss of Mary, you never gave in to bitterness. You never gave up." Robert reflected on his son's words. It was true that he had never completely given up, but he had also never allowed himself to dream of something better. He had accepted his fate as immutable, resigning himself to a lonely and purposeless old age. "I think I just did what needed to be done," he finally replied. "One day at a time." Luke smiled, recognizing in that simple answer all of his father's life philosophy. A man who didn't allow himself great expectations, but who even so had never completely lost hope. "Well, now you don't have to face the days alone anymore," he said, placing his hand on his father's shoulder. "We're all here." That night, lying in his comfortable bed, Robert allowed himself to do something he had avoided for years: plan the future. Not a distant, grandiose future, but small moments that now seemed possible. Taking his granddaughters to the park, helping Luke with the beach house renovation he had mentioned, truly reconciling with Helen, Richard, and Charles. For the first time in many years, the future didn't seem just a somber extension of the present, but a horizon full of possibilities. On the bedside table, the photo of Sarah with baby Luke now shared space with others. An old photo of Mary with the 3 small children, a recent one of Laura and Julia playing with Scruffy in the backyard, one from that day's lunch, with the whole family gathered. Imperfect, but real. Robert fell asleep with a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. The winter in his soul, which had lasted almost a lifetime, finally gave way to a late spring, but no less beautiful for that. Life, in its infinite wisdom, had granted him a second chance. An opportunity to heal old wounds, to build bridges where there were once abysses, to experience the warmth of a true family after decades of cold. And Robert Wilson, the boy from the coal yard, the determined young man, the absent father, the lonely old man, now was reborn as the patriarch of a family united not only by blood ties but by choice, by love. Because in the end, that's what it was all about. Choosing to love, choosing to forgive, choosing to start over, even when time seems to have run out, even when winter seems eternal. Spring always comes eventually, for some later than for others, but it comes. And when it comes, it brings with it the promise of flowers that would never have existed without the rigor of the winter that preceded them. Dear listeners, we hope that Robert Wilson's journey has touched your hearts. This story reminds us that it's never too late to start over, to find the warmth of a family, even after a lifetime of emotional winter. To continue being moved by equally touching and profound stories, we've prepared a special playlist that you can find by clicking on the link to the left of the video. There you'll discover other narratives of new beginnings, forgiveness, and late love that will certainly resonate in your souls. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on this video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of human life in all its nuances. Also share in the comments your impressions about Robert's story. Do you believe in second chances? Have you lived or witnessed a late new beginning like his?